Welcome back to our brain demonstration videos. This time I'm going to give you an overview of horizontal or axial sections of the brain. And this seems to be a fairly important clinical sectioning plane. We get the horizontally oriented forebrain images that will translate into axial sections. And as you go from superior to inferior or ventral, going over this rather thick slice containing corpus callosum, underneath it the lateral ventricle is more fully revealed. Even the interventricular foramen that we can probe here. And of course, a very nice representation of choroid plexus. And continuing further ventrally by putting the slice aside, here is third ventricle communicating with lateral. We're going in the anterior direction, and then the posterior horn of our lateral ventricle is also visible. I will show you one more level, and this is how far we will go ventrally. In this particular case, to show where the anterior commissure is, where I'm pointing, and a very large representation of the third ventricle. So we will stop here, and when we come back, we're going to revisit some of the high yield slices, mainly focusing on the various telencephalic structures that we should identify. At this time, we are going to look at two horizontal levels of the forebrain. Once again, for orientation, this is the frontal or anterior pole, and to the right, here is the occipital or posterior pole. First, we can observe the genu of corpus callosum, and then septum pellucidum, followed by the columns of the fornix. The columns of the fornix are directly adjacent to the interventricular foramen, which is here. The interventricular foramen connects the lateral and the third ventricles. Bulging into the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle is the head of the caudate nucleus. This white matter collectively is known as the internal capsule, specifically the anterior limb, the genu, and the posterior limb of the internal capsule. The putamen, as identified here, is part of the striatum, the dorsostriatum, directly lateral to the posterior limb. And then the thalamus, which is part of diencephalon, is directly medial to the posterior limb, as demonstrated here. Also visible is the splenium of corpus callosum here, more posteriorly, adjacent to the occipital or posterior horns of the lateral ventricle with the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus. I am now going to switch to a more ventral slice. The next slice that will show us the localization of anterior commissure, as indicated here. Many of the same structures are also visible that we have just observed with some additions. So the anterior horn is still here, the lateral ventricle, head of caudate, anterior limb of internal capsule, the genu and the posterior limb. But in this territory, in addition to the putamen here, we can also observe the more medially located globus pallidus. And once again, on this side, putamen, and more medially, globus pallidus. All lateral to the posterior limb of internal capsule, whereas the thalamus is medial to the posterior limb, but directly adjacent to the third ventricle, as you can see here. Caudally, in the third ventricle area, connecting the two sides of the thalamus and epithalamus, this is the posterior commissure. And this would be an uncut pineal gland at this level. Here, we can see a small glimpse of the splenium of corpus callosum. And finally, this territory is still continuing as the posterior or occipital horn of the lateral ventricle well into the occipital lobe. Finishing up our demonstration in the slice, just lateral to putamen. This is a band of white matter, the external capsule, and then a layer of gray, colostrum, and lateral to colostrum, another band of white, the extreme capsule. And the extreme capsule is just underneath our insular cortex. The insular cortex is outlined like so.